Hi friends. Good to see these lovely faces. My dad and I are going to play some music for you all, so I hope you listen. Okay, I'm going to start with a little alap, which is an unmetered introduction of a raga, and today I'll be playing for you Rag Jaunpuri. The sentiments are of devotion and also renunciation. So wherever we may think to understand where Ralph's spirit has gone, this raga is meant to help it travel to a place of bliss. So this is Rag Jaunpuri. This is my father, Pandit Ashwin Batish on tabla, and my name is Keshav Batish. And I hope you all enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. I think it's coming to about 1 o'clock when we're going to look forward to some speakers over here. I just want to say this is a great honor and a pleasure. Ralph Abraham has been a critical and a very beautiful addition to our family for many, many years. And, he has been an agent to the Batish family, and we honor his spirit today. He studied with my father, music of India, starting back in the 60s when he came to visit us in England. And because of him, our entire family moved to Santa Cruz, and it has been quite a beautiful time, being with him. And he saw my children grow up, many of them in his arms, and we are really blessed to have his blessing all these years. So thank you for coming, and I'm sure that there's other events are going to be happening. I'm not too familiar with them myself, so again, I would like to thank my son for joining me and playing the beautiful sitar as he did. So thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. My name's Lyle Troxel. I grew up with Ralph as a family friend, Ralph and Ray as family friends. And then worked with him for a decade at UCSC. Today, we're gonna have about an hour of people speaking about Ralph and their experiences with him. I'm gonna go over the names real quick so you get an idea of what's going on. It's gonna be me for a minute, then Ray, and then we're gonna have Frank Jazz, a letter from Ralph's kids. T. Mike Walker is going to talk a little bit about stuff. Oh, I think before that's Michael Beeson. Ed Lancerman, who couldn't be today, has a letter I'll be reading. And Dan will finish us off, Dan Friedman. And then we might, after that, invite people to stretch their legs and open mic for people that might want to speak, depending on how much time we have. Any questions? All right. I do want to thank you all for being here physically, and for those of you who are virtually, we are streaming. Ashwin Batish, who I think he just took off to take his kids home. That was lovely. Let's do one more applause for them. The planning of this day was done by many people, lots of hands. I'm not gonna be able to list them all, but I tried. So here it is. I wanted to start with Dan Friedman over here to my right. Yes, good. Dan and Ray called Maggie and I a couple months ago and said, we don't think this is gonna happen unless someone does this. Will you please do this? And we reluctantly said yes. So without Dan doing that, this probably wouldn't have happened. So thank you, Dan. Where's Andrew? Andrew's in the back of the room. Oh, there's lots of Andrews, sorry. Andrew O'Keefe is back there, and he's running the streaming. And thank you so much for doing this. He's also recording it, and there'll be a video of this available later if you want to share it with people that you don't see here today. Andrew, how many people are with us on the stream?
36.
Great, good. That means there's actually seats up here, so any in the back they're standing, you can come sit down. You probably saw the table of books outside, out front with the gathering. And what's a gathering for Ralph and with Ralph without books? So T. Mike Walker, thank you for doing that. He'll be speaking a little bit later. A giant thank you needs to go to Jacob Amon. Jacob, where are you? Jacob's also in the back of the tech table. It is really weird not to be doing the tech for this. Jacob runs the website for HIP Santa Cruz and also made the RSVP page, managed the emailing list, included me on everything, talked to Ralph, continually participated in weekly meetings. But Jacob's just an amazingly wonderful man, and he came from out of town to do this. And he's the one that organized the slideshow. So thank you so much, Jacob. There's been a mix of people. I'll just mention Jennifer Gonzalez helping us to connect with the Danum community. Who was here from the Danum community who was involved in Danum Digital Media? Yeah, thank you, Jennifer, for helping that to happen and communicate with them. Catherine Baldwin, who's probably not here, but I'm not sure. Catherine, are you here? Catherine is the department manager for the math department. And when we reached out to the math department, in fact, Dan reached out to the math department, said, could you help out? She's like, yes. And she organized communication to alumni and emeritus people. Who heard that? Who heard from that? And that's why you're here. Yeah, big group of people. Thank you. So thanks to Catherine. But Catherine didn't just do that. She also organized the math department to pay for this venue today. So thanks to the math department and to Catherine. Who here brought something? Thank you all very much for making a potluck happen. Growing up in Santa Cruz with a lot of you as my hippie parents in some ways, seeing a spread like this brings me back to my childhood, and it's just lovely to see it. Thank you for doing that. And I want to close with thanking my wife, Maggie Hooks, who's in the back. For those of you that don't know, Maggie organized the venue, organized the food, organized the tablecloths, the water, the drinks, all of the flowers, most of which are from our garden, which she manages. Talked to the facility to make sure we wouldn't upset anybody. Just did so much wonderful things. Thank you very much, Maggie. I'm going to speak about Ray, and then she'll come up here. Ray Gwinsmith, if you didn't know, holds a Master's of Fine Arts in painting with honors from the College of Art and Design, Manchester University, England. Her early professional life was in Los Angeles, where she exhibited in numerous galleries, solo, large-scale works, including a variety of juried shows, like the Young Artist exhibit at the LA County Museum of Art, and several shows at La Cienega Boulevard, and she, including her one-woman show at the Molly Barnes Gallery. While in LA, Ray organized both independent and group art teaching experiences. Ray has traveled extensively. I probably don't have a full list here, painting as she goes, or at least she used to. I don't know if she's still doing that now. Outer Hebrides, Scotland, England, India, and Nepal, to just name a few. She became one of Santa Cruz's treasured artists in 1972 when she settled down, though she was here a little bit earlier. No, in 1972. And she settled in Bonnie Doon with Ralph in 1976 in their paired homes, which I think for anybody that's ever been married is a fantastic idea. Ray has never stopped painting, never stopped being a thoughtful and kind partner to a few lucky dogs, a horse, and one extremely lucky fellow, her lifelong companion and husband, Ralph. Ray's second, Ray, you can start walking up if you'd like. Ray's second lifelong love has been horses. While visiting Ralph and Ray, and in the later stages, one of the things that guests got to do was hang out with Ralph and chat about all the things, while Ray took a break and took a neighbor's horse and rides bareback through Bonnie Doon. Ray Gwinsmith, come on up. Is that good?
I guess, yeah, thanks.
I'll get better as the day goes on. Okay.
Okay. It's funny to be introduced with all that about my very early life as a painter, because it seems like such a long time away. Anyway, I mean, this isn't about me. This is about Ralph. And he had a very big presence in the world. And I was really not part of that. My life was very private with Ralph and very much based in our sort of sanctuary home in Bonnie Doon. But I thought I'd start with a story when Ralph and I had not been together for very long, because it has a sort of paradigm of how we were together that carried on through the years. So this is what happened. Ralph and I turned up in Kathmandu in 1972, and there were not very many Westerners there at the time, maybe half a dozen. And but there were the Peace Corps, and the Peace Corps people had opened up this little cafe. It was called Aunt Jane's Cafe, and all they served was tea and apple pie. So we would go there if we were so sick of rice and beans. We would go there. And on the notice board, one day we saw this little map, just 8 by 10 Xerox map. And it said something like, go trekking, and just a couple of lines, just Xerox. And so we pull off this map and Ralph says, let's go. So I said, okay. So we got the bus to the end of the road, Pokhara. And there we are, in like Indian pajamas. We'd just been in an ashram, Indian pajamas and, not really prepped at all. And we get off the bus, and the next day we start off with this little map. So Ralph is a mathematician. So the way he is in the world is sort of different from me. So his idea is he looks at the different villages on the map and he measures it all out and he decides how many miles we should do a day. So he decides on 25. So, okay, Ralph. So here we go. At this point, there were no roads. There were barely any paths. We're talking about jumping rock to rock along a stream, and then looking for dust where, or we'd see porters and we'd go, which way? Okay. So it was kind of like that. 5 days in, we get into this village. We're exhausted. And this guy runs up to us, a Nepalese villager, walks up with a piece of paper, and on the piece of paper it says, "Help! I am ill. Follow this guy." And we are going, okay. I'm like, oh God, I can't walk another step. And Ralph goes, no, we have to help. So we're thinking it's going to be like on the edge of the village, right? So we're like off in the dark. We end up wading across a river up to our armpits. We're like on and on. Finally, we get to this rice paddy, and there's a little grass hut. And in the hut, there's this family sitting there on one side, and they're taking care of this guy. Is this very tall guy, like across the whole end of the room. And he says, I'm really sick. I need someone to carry me out of here. I need portered out of here. Okay, we're 5 days away from the road. And I'm thinking, and I'm thinking, can't be that sick. Ralph is saying, oh no, we have to help him. So we go back across the river and Ralph organizes this whole thing, all these porters, they make a bamboo seat to carry this guy. We go back, we get the guy on the seat, and they can only run a little ways and then they have to turn it over to the next guy because they're little. I mean, they're, 5'3", these people. Okay, so turns out this guy is a white South African racist, and he is screaming abuse at the porters. So we get done half an hour down the stream bed, and I'm going, I'm not doing this. I'm out of here. And Ralph said, well, we can't leave him. He's really sick. And I go, watch me. And I left. So I left without the map. And then, so it's 5 days walk back to where the end of the road is, Pokhara. And the key to the story is we ended up arriving at the bus station in Pokhara at the same time. And if that had not happened, we would never have had our whole 52 years together. So that was the start, it's like, okay, whatever, So the thing about Ralph is that it was kind of like one adventure after another. And the next one was the card counting thing in Las Vegas, where he had got a whole formula going and stuff. So he's in like a white suit and a white fedora, and I'm in a little velvet miniskirt and a frilly blouse, and I'm shilling for him, we're obviously counters. I mean, we don't look like anybody in the casino. So Ralph would be counting and, stuff. And then these huge, like Perry Mason type people would come and stand behind us. And I'm going, Ralph. And Ralph go, no, there's a formula. Anyway, that was one of the adventures. I can't go into all the adventures, but there were a lot. And some of them were with Ralph, and some of them were independently. We had independent adventures. And the thing that held us together was that in 76, we had bought this 3 acres in Bonnie Doon, and we talked about it, that this would be our, sanctuary. This would be our sanctuary and our kind of launch post for our adventures. So I had a lot of adventures alone in different places, and he did too. But we had this place to come back to. And our relationship was very, very private and not understood by a lot of people. It was very untraditional. We had 2 houses side by side. His house is full of books and computers. Mine is full of paintings and dog hair. It wouldn't have worked if we were trying to do it together. Anyway, that worked really well. So, as I said, our relationship was untraditional, and kind of pretty much hidden from the world, like under the radar. But one thing that used to happen, like on my birthday, Ralph would, he's not a kind of Hallmark card and a dozen roses kind of guy, He would write me a letter. And I want to share part of this letter that he wrote to me on my birthday in 2021, because it's a window into the private life that very few people see. And it's quite personal, but I feel that this is a good place to share it now.
Frank Jazz has a double undergrad degree in mathematics and computer science and a master's of science in computer science, all from here, this lovely campus. Frank helped usher in the internet here at UCSC, writing the first online enrollment system for students, and focusing on a lot of things, including managing spam in the early days when that was so hellish for all of us. Over 5 years, he was program coordinator and instructor for UCSC Extension, designing the certificate program for the C language and the Unix programming language. And he has also had a lustrous career in many businesses. And of course, he's a good friend of Ralph. Frank Jazz.
Sorry.
It's actually my
Needs to go up a little bit.
It does. We know. We all know. I think that'll work.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Oops.
Okay. Fair enough.
Well, the one thing that was left off of that is I'm also an IT administrator extraordinaire, and just by accident having to manage my own systems. And that's actually how I ended up getting to know Ralph quite well, because we both ended up buying the same experimental computer systems at the same time. Next computers, and we were a couple of the only folks that had them, and so we were constantly in communication with how to get them running and what to do with them, and then because of that, we ended up writing a book together with my good friend and his good friend Will Russell on how to navigate the internet in 1994, how to set things up and for different computers and such. And then a few years later, through serendipity, he had a space in his office in the Sash Mill open, and he offered it to me because I was also needing a place to work. And so it's quite handy because we had all the computers in one place and we could do all the IT stuff. And so I ended up moving there and working in the same office with him for about 8 years. And I was upstairs doing my computers, and he was downstairs doing his thing, and we had all kinds of gear there, if you remember that office. And most of the time, we worked independently. He was, doing his thing, and I was doing my thing. But being upstairs, I did get a sense of all the people that would come into the office. and to see Ralph. And there was such an eclectic group. They were all over the map. There were folks from the university, of course, lots of ex-students. His students just loved coming in and talking to him. There were people from the arts community because he was also dabbling in various musical endeavors, trying to intersect nonlinear dynamics with various instruments and things. And then the people were coming in to help him with his projects, putting the books of Euclid online in an interactive form, just to name one of them. Also, a Yarrow application. That's like, it's I Ching kind of thing. Yeah, so we did that. He was doing that, and then personal projects of his, histories of various kinds. I mean, he was involved in so many different kinds of disciplines and so many different kinds of folks. We were dealing with climate change organizations. This is in the mid-90s, trying to come in and do things. So it's all over the map. And the one thing that was in common, though, was the atmosphere of the office when people came in. And because I was upstairs working away, I didn't really hear what people were talking about, but I could tell what the tone was. And it was all so positive. Everyone was excited to come in and talk to Ralph. And folks were optimistic and energized and enthusiastic. And quite frankly, I probably took that for granted. But looking back on it, I realized that that is quite unusual. Now, working in Silicon Valley for 20 years and working with a lot of people in that environment. And I was thinking, well, what caused that? Well, what caused that was Ralph. Ralph was so open to anyone's communication and anyone's ideas. People would come in with all sorts of things that they're working on and would be able to talk to them. And they would talk to Ralph about, and sometimes I could hear what they were talking about. And they were going off on some flight of fancy, going down and then this way and that way, and really excited because it was their ideas and their thoughts. And Ralph would follow it all. He would be able to follow every single twist and turn and then tie it back to something else and give some extension to the idea or some integration with that in other areas because he was so interested in all these different disciplines. He would bring it back to historical things and how things went back, maybe even all the way back to prehistory, because he was involved with the canon of the Lespew and all these other things. And that is really what characterized that exchange, is that he was so generous with his thinking and with his acceptance, so easy with a smile. People were just drawn to him as an outlet for something that they couldn't really get anywhere else, because nowhere else would really someone be able to listen to all their ideas and then come back with some response that was meaningful and showed that he had listened and that he cared about what that person was bringing. And that is really, I think, why so many people are here and why one of the big reasons why he had such a big impact. And it was all in the pursuit of improving our understanding of the world around us in all its different, interesting perspectives. And just looking at the books that he wrote and all the different kinds of ways he approached that sort of underscores that. And so that is really, for me, what I realize is unique about Ralph Abraham, and one of the things that I'm going to miss. Going out for coffee with him every 6 months or so after we closed up the office, and just being able to go off on whatever direction and having a companion in that journey.
We had planned, and I chatted with Kat Harrison. Unfortunately, she was too ill to come down. So Kat, I hope you're on the stream. I'm sure you are. You might know her as the anthropologist of the psychedelic underground. So luckily, since Kathleen was sick, we got blessed to have Michael Beeson come. Ralph's colleague, friend, a mathematician, a programmer, a professor, a hippie, and a spiritual aspirant. Thank you. Just a second. Thanks.
I first met Ralph in 1967 or 1968. I was a grad student at Stanford. Both Ralph and I had a lot of energy. And at the blackboard, Ralph taught me catastrophe theory, drawing lots of pictures of the catastrophes. Ralph was 9 years older than I, and he was already famous, and so he didn't become a part of my life at that point. 1971, I went to UC Santa Cruz in the fall as what is now called a postdoc. I was a young logician, but I was also a young hippie. I was also a young follower of the Eastern meditation teachers who at the time were bringing the wisdom of the East to the spiritually bankrupt, decadent, but rich West. Ralph had come to Santa Cruz, not because it was the natural mathematical follow-on to his Princeton and Berkeley opening act, but because he too was a hippie and a follower of the Eastern teachers. In his office at UCSC, he had made catastrophe theory into an experimental science by pointing a video camera at a monitor with a time delay in the cable, producing all sorts of chaotic patterns on the screen and explaining them with catastrophe theory. He had a fanciful name for this device, but I can't recall it today. Yeah, but he had a name for it. I can't remember what he called it. That's right. You saw it too, huh?
You were one of my professors, so. But Ralph was, he created all these wonderful gadgets and things.
He introduced me to his friends, the Batish family, whom you saw a little earlier. Mr. Batish, that is the father of the older one today, was my first sitar teacher. He was also Ralph's tabla teacher. So, then my second sitar teacher was his son, Aswan, who was playing the tabla today. When I walked in, I mistook Aswan's son for Aswan because he looked like Aswan used to look. The matriarch of the family ran their Indian restaurant where Ralph and I loved to eat, and I would try to cook Indian food, and the matriarch would offer me advice. Ralph stayed friends with this family all his life, as they told you, long after the restaurant closed and the old couple died. In Ralph's Princeton days, he had written a book called The Foundations of Mechanics. It's a fat book, and it's full of difficult and profound mathematics, the point of which was to update the 19th century work on gravity and motion and place it in the context of late 20th century mathematical analysis, which was phrased in terms of function spaces. This book is still regarded as authoritative in the field. If you look it up, it has thousands of citations. But Ralph already, at that time, was done with that paradigm. He had been to India, he had taken LSD, no more abstract symbolic mathematics for Ralph. Inspired by his psychedelic experiences, he wrote, over the coming years, a series of books called Visual Mathematics. I think it ran to 7 or 8 volumes, full of pictures, not equations. These pictures were very ingenious and beautiful. Ralph was so convinced that laypersons could learn mathematics by pictures that he gave a public lecture series, which were given in the conference rooms of Cruz IO's internet service. And I attended those lectures. because I knew I could always learn something from Ralph, and they were brilliant. That took place in April 2003, by which time I think the books were already all written. So, backtracking again to 1973, I was at UCSC as a postdoc 2 years, 1971 to 73, and in the fall of 1973, I met Ralph's new girlfriend, Ray, who was in those days called Rainbow. It was the hippie era. I had another name for a while too. Ralph departed in the fall of 73 for Nainital, India, to be with his guru, Nimkurli Baba. By the time Ralph returned to Santa Cruz, I was in Europe, bouncing around Europe for several years. And in 1981, I returned to California with a job at San Jose State and a Dutch wife and a very young daughter. Ralph had a house on North River Street with a lot of land in the back going down to the river. Ralph and I sat on the floor of the more or less unfurnished living room filled with hippie paraphernalia. I heard the stories that he had to tell of his mathematical life and his spiritual journey in India. Ralph himself has written down the story of how he was called by Nimkurli Baba and eventually reached his ashram. If you don't know that story, you should look it up in Ralph's writing. It's a wonderful story. Nimkurli Baba told Ralph, once he finally got there, that Ralph, was destined to interpret the Vedas to the 20th century West. Ralph was not the type of guy to be intimidated by any task. And so he set about learning Sanskrit so that he could interpret the Vedas to the West. But as far as I know, that's one task he never did fulfill. I don't think he ever interpreted the Vedas to the West. But in his mind, that assignment from Nimkurli Baba became related to his visual mathematics project, and it put some kind of spiritual force behind his efforts to interpret mathematics to the public. Around this same time, it became possible to write graphics programs on the IBM PC, and Ralph introduced me to Halo Graphics, and he wrote a program that would graph a function. And I was very impressed. Up to that time, programming was text only. And this early demo of Ralph helped inspire me to write my program, Math Expert, which I later spent about a decade doing to help people learn algebra and calculus. Ralph and I both learned C programming from Al Kelly, who is sitting right there. In 1993, I was in Ralph's office when a pivotal event took place. Ralph demonstrated the internet. At that time, the internet consisted of fewer than 100 computers linked by a primitive network. There was no HTML, there was no graphics, it was text only, and you had to type a bunch of arcane stuff in and wait a while to connect to one of the computers on the internet. And what Ralph and I did that day was to connect to a CIA computer and look up in its database what the population of India was, which seems like a trivial thing now, but in those days you would have had to go to the library or take a book off your shelf to find the population of India. So it was a demo. HTML, as I said, didn't exist then, and I looked it up today. It actually didn't really exist until 1995. So this demo was 2 years in advance of what we now would think of. In other words, the internet came at least 2 years before the World Wide Web. And Ralph was on it in 1993. And so what do you think I asked Ralph after that demo? I said, "What is it good for?" I didn't say to myself, "Hey, we could use this to sell stuff and deliver it to every house." I said, "What is it good for?" But Ralph had a sense that this was going to be important, though he couldn't say why. Just for comparison, the first international emails took place already in 1986, so the web was a long time coming after email. Ralph retired from UCSC in 1993, which was pretty early, and he gave a party that he called his graduation party to celebrate his retirement. He certainly didn't intend to become inactive. In subsequent years, he always had several projects going. His house was full of computer equipment, and he was chronically short of money to buy the next piece of computer equipment that was absolutely necessary to advance his project. And for example, in 2001, he applied for military money to apply chaos theory to epidemic detection and visualizing data on terrorist networks. That amazed me because Ralph was a kind of peaceful guy. So, but he needed $3,000 a month to keep his visual math office open, the one that Frank was just talking about in the sash mill. And he was worried that his private school consultancy might end. Through this visual math office, Ralph operated his own internet provider service too with Frank. And they were for a while my internet provider. In 2004, though, he got an NSF grant with Dan Friedman, who's sitting over there, and for work on experimental economics. And for that, he wrote programs in a programming language called NetLogo for agent-based simulations. And Ralph was very happy, both about the work and also about solving his financial problems. Ralph was a ham radio operator, which he had been ever since high school, but he began using that skill to help with a disaster warning network up in Bonnie Doon, where if the internet went out, they didn't have a good way to tell each other, look out, the wildfires are coming. But Ralph was going to fix that with his ham radio. As I mentioned, he was designing the mathematics curriculum for a private high school somewhere in the eastern U.S., and he made trips there to consult. And he also made trips to India, where he would cleverly combine some scientific visits with the Calcutta. He timed them to coincide with the Calcutta Music Festival, where you would stay. The Calcutta Music Festival would play all night, unlike here in the U.S., where they have a cutoff time for concerts that still plagues Western concerts.
Speaking of cutoff time.
Oh, well,
Do what you can.
all right. In 2001, Ralph had open heart surgery. When I asked him where he could call to find the outcome of the surgery, he said, just take the outcome for granted. Later on, he had a device in his chest that was malfunctioning, and the doctor had to yank the wires out. And so Ralph gave him the go-ahead to do that, knowing it might be the last thing he ever did, but it wasn't, luckily. Another example of his projects were the trialogues with Sheldrake and McKenna. One of those was held here in 2003 at UCSC. Ralph believed in ESP, and he claimed that Sheldrake's experiments provided scientific proof. But he had his limits. Once I brought up the subject of aliens and shared a certain account of alien encounters, but Ralph responded, that's fiction. And he was probably right about that. Ralph read extensively and kept careful notes, but he was efficient. He almost never volunteered a subject. For example, I became interested in Egypt and wondered how exactly the pyramids were built and why. Turned out Ralph had read a lot about that, and after the lunch where I brought this up, he sent me a detailed and annotated bibliography about 2 pages long. I think he could do that on any subject.
Thank you.
Okay. I'll skip the rest. I know there's a lack of time, but let me read this, the last paragraph. Ralph was unique in my life in that he could share both my spiritual life and my mathematical life and my programming life too. Ralph was the only person who knew all the sides of me, and I knew all the sides of him too, I think, though he was a very deep person and had a way of surprising me with things I didn't know about him, like his interest in Egypt. Since we shared so much, I'll never forget him, and I'll always honor his memory.
I'm going to read a letter from Ralph's sons, John and Peter. Ralph was a fascinating person, a super passionate, lifelong skier, a famous mathematician, connoisseur of Vermont maple syrup, a father to Peter and John, a grandfather to Gavin, Sadie, Kaya, Arya, and Nina, a brother to Esther, Fred, and Lou, and a husband to Ray, a dear friend, to Minnie. A passionate learner on a wide array of subjects, many unrelated to math. An author of 15 to 20 books, we've lost track. A lover of nature who lived deep in the redwoods of the Santa Cruz Mountains. The memories about our father that stand out to me every day are the many, many ski vacations we took while growing up. I'm not sure Ralph was ever happier than when skiing with his family. That could have been with his kids or his brother, sister, nephews, and niece in Vermont, where he skied until he was about 85. After our parents' divorce, throughout our childhood and teenage years, my brother John and I flew up from our home in San Diego to meet Ralph in Northern California to ski every other weekend and every holiday. When we were in high school and our father had a sabbatical year from the University of California, we moved to Chaumaux, France for the winter, fulfilling a lifelong family dream. In our 6 months there, we enrolled in a French school, learned the language, and skied 5 days per week. It was a formative experience for all of us, and something the three of us were always grateful for. In recent years, we would visit Ralph in Santa Cruz when he could, and we would meet up around the state to keep in touch. He would meet us here in LA for a hike near our house, or ski with his grandchildren in Mammoth, camp with us in Yosemite, go canoeing with family in Vermont, watch his grandson Gavin sail the Monterey Bay. The through line to so much of our time together was time spent outdoors. It's fitting that the last time we saw our father, when we said goodbye, he was in the living room of his house with a view to his beloved redwoods. We'll always remember that place, that setting, that farewell. We'll miss you, Peter and John. T. Mike Walker, come on up. And actually Andrew as well. We have a little bit of a surprise. Andrew Bailey, join us up here, please, too. T. Mike is a former San Francisco policeman, received a master's degree in language arts, and taught writing and literature in SF State for 3 years before moving to Aptos in 1968 to teach English at Cabrillo College, where he was tenured and taught for over 30 years, retiring in 1998. T. Mike worked with Ralph and Paul Lee on the Oral Arts Project, which evolved into Hip Santa Cruz series of books that have touched many of our lives. And joining T. Mike for just a moment, a little bit of surprise, is Andrew. Andrew, can you come up? Where are you? Good. You don't even know about this. Come on up, Mike.
I don't know. We're supposed to do what? You gonna sing, Andrew?
No, Andrew will listen.
Oh, that's right. Please read what it says. This is for Ralph, a very special thing.
So this is a total surprise, kept it a total secret. If anybody in this room has heard of the Visioneers International Network of Visioneers, anybody heard of it? It's pretty obscure. It's like a Nobel Prize for complete unknowns. Let's put it that way. That's not a bad thing. And this is called, it's awarded to Ralph Abraham. It's called a Lifetime Achievement Award as a hero of humanity. This is a very different type of organization. They're absolutely beautiful. They're out of Vancouver, BC, and I'm just honored to have been able to do this. The only way you can get to do it is you have to be nominated for one yourself, so I'm rather proud of that. And then once you're nominated, you can, and this is only the second posthumous award of this nature. The first one went to Barbara Marx Hubbard, if anybody's heard of her, the futurist, right? So yeah, that's that story, my dear friends. And I'm going to get this to Ray. And I met Ralph in London in 1969, and he said, come to UC Santa Cruz, and I did, and here I still am, although I've been living on the East Coast, but here's a secret, we're moving back, like next week.
Thank you, Andrew.
Andrew also has the lead story in volume 7, which tells the rather dramatic story of how he came to the United States from South Africa and well worth your read, for sure. How you doing? Anyhow, I'm here to talk about, everybody has wonderful stories about Ralph, and I'd love to hear them all. And I'm sure you'll share them some with Jacob, who's videoing this whole thing as well. I met Ralph at a moon festival that was held behind my house in Aptos. A moon festival was a gathering of people who were mostly acid heads at that time. We called them hippies. But there were a lot who weren't that way too, which is even better. And we had these parties at every full moon. And it went on until one night we were crashed by the Hells Angels, and we had to play music until 4 a.m. to keep them dancing so they didn't get too rowdy. And that we decided that was the end of the moon festivals. We were not going to do that one anymore. But at that, before that, I had met him at one of these festivals, and we had a psychic encounter where we were both laughing and talking to each other telepathically. I can only tell you that we exchanged a lot of information. You may think I'm out of my mind, and we were at that point. That's the whole point of being on LSD. You step aside, you open your mind, and you, in the opening mind, you begin to hear other people in the depths of your mind, in the depths of your heart. And it's a wonderful experience. I'd only had it a few times up to that point. But Ralph and I had quite a rapport, lasted, who knows, half an hour. And then we actually talked. And he said, I want you to come to my house. I'm having a dinner there in about a month. Kirby Hensley's going to be there. Kirby Hensley was the head of the Universal Life Church at that time, and he was on a rampage to tax all the churches in America, which I still think is probably a damn good idea. At any rate, he said at the dinner, anybody who wants to become a Universal Life minister, raise your hand. So 3 or 4 of us, including Ralph, raised our hands. We became ministers. Shortly after that, I was asked to perform a wedding for Linda Berman and Charlie Hall. Linda Berman became the head of the music department here, fabulous musician. But that's enough. Later on, Ralph said he was going to start an oral history project, and he needed some help. So I jumped in. Paul Lee was doing it, a bunch of other people, most of whom have died at this point. And we started, the idea was to try and talk to all the people we knew of who had very interesting, engaging lives and minds, and ask them if they had ever tried LSD or the psychedelic mushrooms, and if so, how those had affected them and their work. And so we began the project, and volumes 1 through 7 of the book of the Hip Santa Cruz series are reflections of those oral histories. But we stopped doing the question-answer part about the end of book 2. We were getting really bored with that particular thing and said, why don't these people write their own stories? Or why don't we ask them what's going on and we'll write the stories for them? So that's how we did it. Ralph's last words to me, and we met in January of last year to discuss volume 7. At that point, we had a few stories up on the website. And Jacob says, yes, we can put more stories up on the website. So if you had a story and you didn't get around to telling it, talk to Jacob Amen before it's all over. But so we started that, and Ralph had this vision that, let me just read his vision, which he put at the end of number 2, and I'll tell you what we were working for. He said, I began the Hip Santa Cruz History Project and website with the idea that the 1960 hip culture movement was a miracle. And even though it did not last, I still believe it was a miracle. And thus, it proves that miracles in the form of major cultural transformations are possible. And thus, there may be some hope for the future on planet Earth, despite all appearances to the contrary. Thank you. Thank you so much. Oh, the books are, I have a limited number of these books, volume 7 and a few others, for sale outside of here for after. Thank you very much.
Pablo Villota holds a Master's of Science in Applied Economics and Finance and a PhD in Politics from UCSC. He is currently a professor of political science at California State University, Chico. Pablo's research explores how artificial intelligence is reshaping governance, equity, and human development. Recent publications include studies on AI accessibility, immersive learning environments, and Monte Carlo simulations of AI-driven inequity. Pablo and Ralph met at UCSC in the 80s, and Pablo has been a member of the weekly X Talks discussions of ideas, which I think a lot of us probably are since then. Pablo, welcome.
Thank you all so much. So I'll echo a lot of the themes that we've had today. I came to Santa Cruz in the late 1990s. I think I got here winter of 1997. My sister at the time was, always suggesting that, hey, I was studying at musical theater and opera at Emerson College in Boston, and that wasn't working out as much. It was great, but we looked at the UC Santa Cruz catalog, and she said, "What's this? Math 145, Intro to Chaos Theory. You've got to go out there." And it took a year to sort of get through that application process, and I came out here, and my first semester was incredible. I was enrolled in artificial intelligence and music, and doing a lot of the math classes that were prep work to take Math 145. It wasn't a math major, but I was going to take everything I needed to get into that class. And a number of people from that cohort, and I think it was the last time Math 145 was taught in the winter of 1998, and many of us from that cohort are here. And so I'm going to focus on this amazing discussion group that we had oftentimes weekly, at least once a month for 25 years. So what happened with Math 145 is that there were discussion sections, but they weren't discussion sections to necessarily talk about the curriculum. They were breakout discussions to talk about all kinds of things, from cosmology to astrophysics and contemporary politics. We started off having these conversations in the meadow by what is now the Danum area and the music building, right? This beautiful space there. And we would sit under one of those oak trees in a circle. And this was transformative to a lot of us. So much good came out of that. So we'd have these large circles, and it was the first time in my life, I think, that I really learned how to actively listen to others. The format was talking stick, so that you'd arrive at X Talks and be in this circular format, and you would get an allocation of time, maybe 5 minutes or something like that, and then you would pass the talking stick on and listen to the next person. So there was a real egalitarian aspect to all of this, and then at the end there would be more of a free-form synthesis that would take place, and lots of amazing ideas came out of that. I know a lot of you can relate to, and so here, and Lyle as well attended a number of X Talks. I can remember, in fact, driving down or riding down sometimes on the bus on Saturday mornings. We would have X Talks at the old Espresso Royale Cafe, which became Lulu Carpenter's. And Lyle had a radio show at the time, Geek Speak, and so I'd be listening to the beginning of that just as I arrived for X Talks and whatnot. So I'm hearing everybody speak here. There are so many crisscrossing patterns. The community that Ralph helped build is widespread and overlapping and really beautiful. So let me get through some of my notes here, things I wanted to share that are unique to that. He kept a log of most of these X Talks, actually, which I think there's a few of them that are on his website, but it's really extensive. And so I went back, I found an entry Monday, October 18th, 1999. This would have been about a year and a half or so after that class, where we kept meeting, not on campus, but all over Santa Cruz. And so he writes in these notes, in terms of planning, we met at the Whole Earth. That was on campus, 6 to 7:30 p.m. We will continue this venue for a while. In the winter, we will become Kresge 194. So there was actually a class that we all participated in, many did, on consciousness studies. That was a Kresge College class that you could get 5 units from doing that and talk about all kinds of compelling things. And here are some other notes from Friday, November 5th, 1999. We are now meeting regularly both on Mondays, MX, and Fridays, MX. Until further notice, all meetings will now be at Berk, B-E-R-C, back of the Espresso Royale Cafe. New agenda was discussed and approved, meeting time to be split equally between X, Chaos, the traditional X circle, and K, Cosmos. Focus on an agenda chosen at the start of the gathering, bring an item if you wish, and so forth. So this was really compelling. Lots of ideas were generated, and the community grew. And I, through this process over the years, collaborated personally with Ralph on. I was doing electronic music and political science, and hanging out with Ralph in his studio, and he'd come over to the Electronic Music Center at UCSC, and we developed an aural version of Kepler's Music of the Spheres, which he was very careful to render the data from Kepler's original manuscripts. And this was presented at San Francisco Art Institute back in 2022, and then later performed much later in 2019 at the 500th anniversary of Kepler's book, Harmonious Mundis, and so he was involved in everything, art and music. Cool, one of the coolest people that you could know. So I was gonna just read another thing or two directly from him. Let me. This is the kind of excerpt when I looked at his books that seemed to be something that would encapsulate a lot of what the draw was in terms of this wonderful idea space. So he writes in Chaos Gaia Eros, I think that was around 1997 or so. When I returned to California in 1974, I began a program of research and teaching on vibrations, chaos, computation, and computer graphics, delving deeply into the histories of these subjects, going ever backward into the Baroque, to the Renaissance, to ancient Greece and beyond. Soon after my return, I found other people who shared these interests. We were working on a general evolution theory, a whole systems theory evolving from the work of a number of 20th century scientists interested in conceptualizing a science of the all and everything. The theory offered a strategy by which to understand the structure of history through the kind of mathematical model introduced by René Thom, one of the originators of catastrophe theory, right? Here, my Himalayan cave illuminations could be abstracted and applied to society, to the history of consciousness and unconsciousness, and therefore to the future. So with that, I'll pass the baton back to Lyle, and just to say, this community has been amazing to be a part of, and actually Dan Friedman, who will be one of the next speakers, was great. I had Dan Friedman as one of my professors and Ralph at the same time, and it was amazing. So anyway, thank you all so much, and we'll pass.
Thank you. Ralph spent time at Berkeley and Columbia and Princeton, and in 1968 came here. And at the math department already was Ed Lancerman. And Ed, unfortunately, couldn't make it today. He's probably watching streaming. Thank you. But Ed told me a great little story about them. So Ed's a professor in the math department. Ralph comes in. There's a little bit of political issues with Reagan and such, but Ralph's awesome in lots of ways. In any case, Ed and Ralph were colleagues for, 25 years. They didn't really talk or work with each other, which is surprising considering how much Ralph did that. When the fires hit in 2020, and Bonnie Doon was in danger of fire, as was most of Santa Cruz Mountains, Ralph was like, I really should get into ham radio again. And he's like, I think Ed knows about ham radio. So he contacted Ed, and they hit it off. And sure enough, Ed had all the information on the current tech in ham radio. And if you did ham as a kid and haven't done it in 20 years or so, or 50 years, whatever, it's amazing right now. The radios are really cheap and it's a lot of fun. In any case, he did get his license working again. So if you want to reach out to Ralph, his his ham radio call sign is W1VDX. So go ahead and talk to him. Thank you, Ed, for that story. Next up, Dan Friedman. We'll talk more about Ralph's UCSC connections. Dan's own connections to UCSC goes back to the fall of 1968. Eager to avoid returning to rainy Oregon, he found a back door that allowed him to complete his math undergrad degree here at UCSC. The following year, the UCSC math department launched a new PhD program, and Dan joined that as well. Dan was Ralph's first PhD advisee at UCSC, but he actually continued at Berkeley. After a short sojourn in industry in 1980, Dan joined the econ department at UCLA. And shortly after, in 1985, when a place opened here, he came to his home here at UCSC. He never left. Until 2020, he's been a professor of economics and now is emeritus and a good friend of Ralph. Daniel.
I had a longer version, but you guys have been here for a long time and patient, so I'm going to do a 3-minute version and set the style for if you have an open mic later. I first saw Ralph in October 1968 at an anti-war, anti-Regents demonstration in Crown College courtyard. Ralph was dressed in a flag suit, gleefully leading cheers and hurling insults at the Regents and at the military-industrial complex that they represented. I didn't know faculty did that sort of thing. About a year later, I joined the initial cohort of the math PhD program here, and I took most of the courses that Ralph offered: global analysis, classical mechanics, bifurcation theory. Most of my professors in the other classes would walk us through proofs step by step. Ralph's approach was different. He'd say something about the historical background, the historical unfolding of ideas. He'd sketch the geometric intuition behind some tricky definitions and give some hints about the main proofs. But homework for class, the students would go, our homework was to get together, hash out all the details, and write it up. Starting around 1971, this is maybe a precursor of X, Ralph organized some evening gatherings for 6 or 8 of us graduate students about once a month. It's sort of like a political cell meeting for the counterculture, or maybe a little like easygoing encounter group, or maybe just like a math reading group, some kind of mix of that. We'd tell each other about the latest ideas from the counterculture that was going on the inner growth side, and also to some degree the outer political counterculture. But uniquely, our meetings tried to weave mathematics into the picture. You've heard about all kinds of joint ventures that Ralph had with all sorts of different people. HIP, Santa Cruz, the X classes, many more. Time doesn't permit me to detail my own joint adventures with Ralph, which included building a prototype macroscope. It involves bifurcations of Chladni nodal lines. In the 1970s, our joint NSF grant awarded in 2005, and many catch-up lunches. But let me just say a little bit about what Ralph did. He didn't really care much about his personal academic advancement or about publishing articles that impressed other specialists. All Ralph really cared about, I think, was uncovering the deep truths about the universe and leveraging them to make a better world, and the joy of the company of others who joined in that quest. New energy might come from mathematical insights or from music or ancient Vedic texts. It was all part of the journey of discovery in the company of friends. Thank you.
Thank you. That concludes our organized talks. We have a lot of food and we have some time. We need to start cleaning up here at 4. Other than that, you can enjoy. And what we're going to do right now is we're going to let people take a break, walk around, have some food, whatever. In about 10 or 15 minutes, this mic will probably get turned back on for people that want to say something. That's how we're going to do the open mic section of it. Okay? So enjoy yourselves. Have some conversations with each other. I'm sure we'll learn more stories. Oh, Dan, go ahead.
I want to thank Lyle and Maggie for putting this together.
Jay, everybody, sorry, just a second. I just found out that, sorry, everybody. Just found out that Jay Ching of the math department is here. Thank you so much. Where are you? Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much for letting us all be here. Appreciate it very much. Thank you.
you.